20 million people died in World War I. Soldiers drowned in mud in the trenches of France. Civilians starved in the sieges of the Eastern Front. Families across 4 continents received telegrams that ended with the words, "Killed in action." And one man financed both sides. Not accidentally, not reluctantly, not because he had no choice. Deliberately, systematically, profitably. He lent money to Britain. He lent money to Germany. He lent money to France. He lent money to Russia. He lent money to Austria-Hungary. The nations that were killing each other's soldiers by the millions were all borrowing money from the same banker. And that banker collected interest from every single one of them. His name was Jacob Schiff. Or perhaps it was J.P. Morgan. Or perhaps it was a Rothschild. The historical answer is more complicated and more interesting than any single villain. Because the financing of World War I was not the work of one man. It was the work of a system. A financial system that had evolved over a century specifically to profit from war. A system that had no national loyalty. No moral framework that distinguished between the borrower killing and the borrower being killed. Only the interest rate. Only the creditworthiness of the borrower. Only the return. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how that system worked, who built it, who profited from it, and why the same fundamental architecture that financed the death of 20 million people in 1914 is still operating today. This is the story of war finance, and the men who made their greatest fortunes from humanity's greatest catastrophe. To understand how the financing of World War I worked, you need to understand what international finance looked like in 1914. The world of 1914 was in many ways more financially integrated than the world of 1950 or even 1970. Capital moved relatively freely across borders. The gold standard provided a common monetary framework. International bond markets were deep and liquid, and the great banking houses of Europe and America had spent a century building the relationships and the infrastructure that allowed them to raise money for governments anywhere in the world. The dominant institution in this world was not a central bank or a government treasury. It was a private banking family. The House of Rothschild, with major operations in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, had for a century been the primary financier of European sovereign debt. The Rothschilds had financed Napoleon's opponents and then financed France's post-Napoleonic recovery. They had financed the British government during the Napoleonic Wars and then financed the governments of Prussia and Austria-Hungary as those states modernized and expanded. The Rothschilds were not uniquely cynical about this. They were operating within a financial culture that treated sovereign lending as a business rather than a political act. Governments needed money. The Rothschilds had money to lend. The creditworthiness of the borrower and the interest rate were the relevant variables. The cause for which the money would be spent was not a financial consideration. By 1914, the Rothschild network had been somewhat displaced by newer institutions. J.P. Morgan and Company had become the dominant American banking house, with extraordinary connections to both British and continental European finance. The Morgan Bank had financed the reorganization of American railroads, the creation of U.S. Steel, and had twice intervened to stabilize the American financial system during panics. It had strong relationships with the Bank of England and with major British financial institutions. When war broke out in August 1914, the financial implications were immediately clear to the banking houses that would be asked to finance the combatants. War was expensive. The governments of Europe would need to borrow unprecedented amounts of money to fund the armies, the ammunition, the ships, the aircraft, and the logistics of industrialized warfare on a continental scale. The banking houses that could facilitate that borrowing would earn extraordinary fees and profits. J.P. Morgan and Company was appointed as the exclusive purchasing agent for the British government in the United States in January 1915. This was one of the most lucrative financial appointments in history. Britain needed to buy enormous quantities of American goods, munitions, food, raw materials, and equipment. Morgan would handle all of those purchases, earning a commission of 1% on every transaction. Given the scale of British purchasing, which would eventually total over $3 billion, this commission would make the Morgan Bank extraordinarily wealthy. Morgan also organized and led the consortium of American banks that extended credit to Britain and France, allowing them to purchase American goods on credit rather than paying immediately in gold. The first major loan, $500 million in September 1915, was at the time the largest foreign loan ever floated in the United States. Morgan organized the syndicate of 1,500 banks that subscribed to it. The bond offering was multiple times oversubscribed. American investors were eager to lend to the Allies. On the other side of the war, German finance was more complicated. The United States was officially neutral until 1917. But in practice, American financial markets were far more accessible to the Allies than to Germany. A German loan in the American market in 1914 raised $58 million, a fraction of what the Allies could raise. As the war progressed and British naval blockade tightened, Germany's access to American credit effectively closed. But German finance had its own sources. Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, and the German banking system generally financed the German war effort through domestic bond issuances and the resources of the German economy itself. The Reichsbank expanded the money supply. War bonds were sold to German citizens with extraordinary success. The German financial system was mobilized for war with remarkable efficiency. The international banking houses that could truly claim to have financed both sides were more complex than a simple narrative suggests. The Rothschild family itself was divided. The London and Paris branches were firmly aligned with the Allies. The Frankfurt branch was German. Family members on opposite sides of the war were technically financing enemy governments. The family maintained communication through intermediaries for much of the war, a situation that would later fuel conspiracy theories, but that in practice reflected the genuine complexity of international finance in a nationalist age. The neutral countries provided another channel through which financial flows crossed the lines of battle. Swiss banks, Swedish banks, and Dutch banks served as intermediaries through which capital from all belligerents moved. A German manufacturer selling goods to a neutral country might receive payment through a Dutch bank that had relationships with both German and British financial institutions. The financial system found its way around the political boundaries that the war had created. The profits from war finance were extraordinary. J.P. Morgan and Company earned approximately $30 million in commissions from British purchasing alone, equivalent to several $100 million in contemporary terms. The American banks that held Allied bonds earned interest for years after the war ended. The bond dealers who distributed war bonds to retail investors earned their fees on every transaction. But the profits from war finance went beyond commissions and interest. The war transformed the American financial system in ways that produced long-term structural advantages. Before the war, London was the undisputed center of global finance. The City of London was where sovereign bonds were issued, where international trade was financed, where global capital was allocated. American finance was important, but secondary. The war changed this permanently. Britain financed the war partly by selling its American investments, liquidating the portfolio of American stocks and bonds that British investors had accumulated over decades. This sale transferred ownership of American assets from British to American hands and earned the dollars that Britain needed to buy American goods. By the end of the war, America had gone from being a net debtor nation to being the world's largest creditor. The financial center of gravity had shifted from London to New York. J.P. Morgan and the American banking system were the primary beneficiaries of this shift. The human cost of the war that produced these profits was 20 million dead and 21 million wounded. The financial cost was measured in the sovereign debt burdens that would destabilize European governments for decades. Germany's war reparations, imposed by the Treaty of Versailles and financed by loans from American banks including Dawes Plan bonds organized by J.P. Morgan, would contribute to the economic instability that enabled the rise of National Socialism. The connection between the financing of World War I and the conditions that produced World War II is not simply a matter of historical speculation. The specific financial arrangements of the 1920s, the reparations, the loans, the debt burdens, created the economic conditions that German demagogues exploited. The bankers who financed World War I. Who then financed the post-war reconstruction? Who then financed the reparations regime? Who then financed the loans that allowed Germany to pay reparations while rebuilding its industrial capacity, were active participants in the financial architecture that produced the next catastrophe. The moral question that the financing of World War I raises is one that financial history has largely avoided asking directly. Is there a moral distinction between lending money to a government to fight a war and fighting the war itself? The soldier who pulls the trigger is held to a moral standard that includes the requirement to refuse unlawful orders. Is the banker who provides the money that pays for the bullets subject to any equivalent moral standard? The banking houses that financed World War I would have argued, and did argue, that finance is neutral. That money has no politics. That lending to a sovereign government is a business transaction that carries no moral responsibility for how the borrowed funds are used. That the banker's obligation is to his investors and his institution, not to the populations whose governments borrow from him. This argument was convenient and profitable. It was also the argument that allowed the same financial infrastructure to finance the next war, and the war after that. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, 1 year before the war began, but the institution he built financed the Allied war effort with extraordinary effectiveness. The Morgan Bank's successors, through a century of mergers and acquisitions, became J.P. Morgan Chase, today the largest bank in the United States. The profits from World War I financing were one of the foundations on which that institution was built. The Rothschild family banking houses survived the war in various forms. The London branch, N.M. Rothschild & Sons, continues to operate as an independent investment bank. The profits from a century of sovereign lending, including the financing of the wars that sovereign borrowers fought against each other, are embedded in the capital that still works in that institution today. 20 million dead, financed by men who collected interest from both sides. Who moved money across the lines that other men were dying to defend? Who calculated creditworthiness while generals calculated casualties? Who earns their greatest profits from humanity's greatest catastrophe? The financial system that made this possible was not destroyed by the war. It was strengthened by it, enriched by it, restructured by it in ways that concentrated financial power more completely in the hands of the institutions that had proven most capable of financing industrial-scale destruction. That system is still operating. The banks are different. The wars are different. The interest rates are different. The logic is the same. If you believe the public deserves to know where the money actually goes, subscribe. Every week, we cover the frauds, the scandals, and the financial crimes the system wants you to forget.